So we're happy to be here and present the book. This is actually the book, the hard copy of the book. So we'll try to tell you a little bit about, well, maybe let's start with the motivation for writing the book. So who did we try to address? What kind of audiences? I think two ways. Firstly, we try to address the historians by showing how disasters can offer an exceptional view on societies. That is, they can illuminate aspects, elements of society that otherwise would remain hidden. They are a kind of an extreme test of societies. They show, they highlight, they uncover, as it were, elements like power disparities, social networks, and vulnerabilities. And by giving these examples, I already show that what we're interested in actually is the functioning of societies. And that I think is a main element, a main focus of the book. How did societies cope with disasters? But also it works the other way around. I think that history can offer a lot to the investigation, the better understanding of disasters. And by offering the long time frame that is needed to understand the impact, the unfolding, and particularly the short and longer term effects of disasters, you can only understand them, analyze them through history. And we also tried to use history as a kind of a laboratory for better understanding disasters. A laboratory not in a strict sense, of course, because you cannot control circumstances in history, but still, what we can do is use all the features history has, the different constellations, the opportunities to select cases and compare them, and through comparative analysis, identify relevant elements, variables, features that decide the unfolding and the outcomes of disasters. So we use history in order to better understand disasters. That's what we try to do. Well, as Michael already said, we did so with a team of 7 authors. Maybe it's also nice to mention that we did not in this book write separate chapters, each of us, but we wrote the book together. That is, all of the chapters are written by 7 authors who jointly wrote, corrected each other, went into discussions and debates with each other, which was a very nice process to end up with this book. Well, to return maybe to say a little bit more about the book itself. I think one of the main conclusions of the book is that any disaster can have very different and divergent outcomes. But even more than that, before a disaster unfolds, there is a shock, often an exogenous shock, a hazard. And this hazard does not mean that a disaster will unfold, because this depends a lot, Jessica, I think about this depends a lot on the preconditions where this hazard occurs. So can you maybe tell a little bit more about this?
Yes, I'd like to. Now that you mentioned this, Bas, I remembered that at a certain point, the editors proposed a title which contained the term natural disasters. Oh. And we said at the time, no, we would like the natural part out of the title, because one of the central arguments in the book is that very few disasters are purely natural. And I think famines are a good demonstration of this fact. Famines are really complex disasters. They're often triggered by a natural event. They're triggered by a weather situation, which in turn causes a harvest failure. But that is not the disaster. That's only the trigger. And it only becomes a disaster when society or a certain community fails to respond in an adequate way. And this, of course, for those of the audience that are familiar with famine studies, links back to what Amartya Sen has been saying, that famines are rarely only production problems, but that they're always also distribution problems. And there the man-made part of the story comes in. So we have in the book a chapter which is about preconditions, which discusses the ways in which societies is arranged that allows societies or groups to respond to a famine in a certain a hazard, a shock in a certain way, which can be an adequate way, in which case the disaster can be at least mitigated or perhaps even prevented, or in a way that allows the disaster to unfold. And if I look, for instance, at the Little Ice Age in Europe, which was, of course, a natural event, it turns out that this Little Ice Age did lead to harvest problems in large parts of northwestern Europe, but not always to famines. That depended very much on the specific situation in specific countries. For instance, in the 1690s, there were repeated harvest failures in large parts of northwestern Europe, but in the Dutch Republic, there was no famine. In England, there was no famine. In northern France, there was a famine. And that had everything to do with situations, social, political, economic conditions in those countries. Perhaps even an example the audience might be more familiar with is, of course, the potato blight of the 1840s, which again, which the potato failed in large parts of the continent, of the European continent, but only in Ireland it caused mass starvation. And that, of course, had to do with, well, economic conditions, in the sense that in Ireland there was this focus on the potato, that it was also a subsistence crop, that it was very intensively cultivated, and as a result, whenever that crop failed, there was immediately a problem. But there were also social conditions which played a part: the poverty of the population, the fact that there were no well-functioning relief systems in place, which did exist in other parts of Europe. And also the political situation played a part, of course. The fact that the English government was way off, that even though Ireland was part of the British Empire, it wasn't really felt as, the Irish population were not really felt as one of us by the English population. There was this a distance between the governed and the government, and all of this played a part in the fact that something caused by a natural event became a disaster. So that's where the man-made elements come in.
Yeah, so Jessica, you tell a lot about the social and the economic, and also about the political circumstances, the preconditions. But what about, for instance, religious or cultural preconditions?
Yes, they also play a part, and we also pay attention to that in the book. It may have played a part in Ireland as well, in the sense that there was also a cultural and a religious gap between the Irish and the English. But to make sure that we don't only discuss the negative consequences, it might be good to also emphasize that we also mention examples where cultural, or in this case religious, conditions have a beneficial effect. For instance, in China, between the 17th and the 19th century, the Qing China, there was the notion that the ruler had a mandate of heaven, and part of that mandate was that he was supposed to avoid disasters occurring. If a disaster occurred, it was seen as a sign that he was no longer worthy to be the emperor. So this was a stimulus to try to avoid problems. And one of the ways to do that was to establish a granary system, a system of public granaries, which really became a really elaborate system in the course of the 18th century, with grain transported over long distances. It cost a lot of money. There was a huge logistic operation, but it did indeed help to stave off the worst conditions, to prevent famine hitting the Chinese population as hard as it would otherwise have done. So yes, those cultural conditions also play a part. And in fact, everything that we now have been discussing comes down to the fact that these preconditions determine to a significant extent the vulnerability and the resilience of societies, which is the subtitle of our book. And those are terms that we have been struggling with ourselves. But perhaps, Bas, you can say a little bit more about that, how we've discussed those concepts.
Yeah. Because the concepts resilience and vulnerability are also a little bit fashionable, and particularly resilience, of course, is a kind of a buzzword. And so we tried really to define, conceptualize further, and also see what the relevance is for the things we try to do to understand how societies cope with external shocks, with hazards. And I think, well, resilience is an important concept also because it focuses on the system as a whole and the functioning of the system as a whole. But we also think that maybe the concept is used a little bit too lightly and also maybe considered in a too positive way, if I may say. And so we are a little bit critical of the concept because if you really look at resilience as the system is resilient when confronted with external shocks, then it turns out all throughout history that most systems are resilient because the systems often can cope very well. But at the same time, this goes hand in hand, this goes along with the vulnerability of large groups within that society, becoming victims of the disaster unfolding. So I think, well, resilience has become a favorite buzzword, but that we also would like to go back to the concept of vulnerability again. That was very important, very relevant in the 1970s and 80s in particular. And we want to reintroduce it and focus again on the relationships between different groups within society. And also to focus on the fact that some groups can be much more vulnerable than all other ones. And maybe what is more than that, that the relationship between these groups often determines what the response to a shock or the unfolding disaster will be, and whether a society will be successful in this or not. And because I think that one of the bigger, more important conclusions of the book is analyzing the divergences, the differences in outcomes between disasters unfolding. And these, of course, as you explained, Jessica, these are shaped to some extent already during the phase of the preconditions that are there and that decides the impact of a hazard, whether a disaster will unfold or not. But I think after this, there are many more phases in the unfolding and the aftermath of disaster that will decide outcomes. And maybe, well, Micah, you can tell a little bit more about this, please.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. One of the innovative things about the book is that we talk a lot about preconditions, and this is something that we really strongly want to put forward. But of course, there is no such thing as an absolute path dependency, that the preconditions can define everything, whether or not it becomes a disaster. And that's maybe what we can see now today. Actually, historians can learn from the present as well, because you can see it today with COVID as well. Even people with quite similar preconditions can implement a wide range of responses. And that's something what we try to do, to look at what kind of responses are there and try not to be stuck in a multitude, but looking at what big differences are there, what kind of big distinctions, but what are also the trends. And of course, one of the most important and biggest distinctions is the difference between bottom-up and top-down responses. And we can see that today, again, states implementing, or some people prefer imposing, measures on local communities versus more bottom-up responses. And one of the things that normally historians like are these teleological or more linear evolutions, let's say. But what we discovered by looking and having a more comparative perspective is that, for example, there is no such thing as the rise of top-down responses and the decline of bottom-up responses, but rather that it depends, and that some societies prefer or rather implement top-down while others do not. There is no better or worse. It depends again on the situation. But one of the things that struck me, and that we have discussed in full in the book, is that often we do rely on the two levels coming together. And one of the examples that I want to put forward there, that again might seem very familiar today, is the imposition of quarantine and very strict rules during pandemics. For example, the plague. And one of these rules was that you could not attend funerals that much, and that it was very restricted. And well, that was a rule that was imposed pretty much everywhere and ignored everywhere. That it was something that people simply did not cope with these kind of rules, and that was then revolted against. And so you can see how these two often have to work together to really to work, or for the rules to actually stick in that kind of society. So that's very important to look at. And what's also very
can I interrupt for a minute? Because when you mentioned this story about the plague, there was something else that came to my mind. Something else that very much comes up also in the COVID crisis is what we mention in the book as the rule of experts. So perhaps you can say a little bit more about that, because I think it really is something that where you can see the parallel with the current day situation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not only just top down, bottom up. A couple of other aspects are very important, whether or not, for example, there is expert knowledge, whether or not they are listened to, and whether or not it's something that actually suits the local conditions. For example, that they are not implementing something that's actually detrimental. Because, well, today, all the debates about whether or not the experts are right or wrong or actually doing more harm is also something that we can see in the past quite a lot. So the rule of experts, something that is, well, we can bring that back to the 16th century. Often they're also very linked to state formation. And we discussed that what are the benefits of having experts, but also how can it have detrimental effects? For example, when people place too much trust in experts, sometimes that creates a false element of security, that you think they will take care of it and we will no longer look at it. And again, yeah, that is something that is quite relevant for today, that we have to be critical while at the same time still relying on technical knowledge that sometimes can only be given by these experts. But also very important is the impediment to a response, because sometimes your country can be full of experts and full of all that kind of knowledge and disaster memory, but if they're not heard, or if there are impediments in a society, for example, certain groups or certain elites block the implementation of certain knowledge, a society is too unequal or too polarized to respond, sometimes that can prevent all these aspects, all these responses that we list, from actually being applied. And that's a quite negative thing to learn from the past, I think, in our laboratory scheme.
Well, that's a good point, Maiko. So you're not talking about direct responses, so that is really the short term, eh? But I think it's also the benefit of history is that we can follow developments after that, not only the short-term responses, but also the longer term. So maybe you can tell a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's the absolute privilege of being an historian, because most of the disaster studies done by political scientists or social scientists is that they can only look at quite short-term responses, a couple of days, weeks, years. And the nice thing for us is to be able to look at centuries, because sometimes you might be very good in a very short-term response, but the long-term effects might actually be negative, because you might not keep up with it, or you may have taken some decisions that in the end prove to be detrimental in the long term. So you have to distinguish between both, but it's also very important to look at the longer term direct, but sometimes also indirect responses, because disasters have a long trail. Often they can set into motion processes that last for centuries. For example, with the Black Death, people have now been arguing that this was actually the most important point where then the big divergence or processes of capitalism were actually coming from. So this might be just a little seed that might have a lot of planned or more indirect consequences. And an example of a very direct one is Pombal in Lisbon in Portugal, that really took that earthquake in the 18th century to say, okay, this is the moment. Now I can just do everything I want and implement all my my big schemes for the country. But sometimes it's just that the population does not recover and has a fundamental effect. The economy is affected because of very unplanned kind of shifts in the economy, but it does have an effect for a very long time, and we have to look at it.
We have a question from the audience.
Okay.
It's about religion, and it actually is related to the notion that disasters have effects. This person asks, ancient disasters gave rise to religion, and can it be repeated nowadays in some different form? So shall I give it a try, and then perhaps the two of you can
go ahead, Jessica. Yeah? Go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, I'm not quite sure if it's actually true that ancient disasters gave rise to religion. That is, there may have been other factors that also gave rise to religion, let's put it that way. But what we do see is that religion plays a part in what we call the phase of sense making. So if you want to look at disasters as a cycle, which is a quite a common way of looking at it. Disasters have certain effects. They lead to certain interventions, which lead to changes, which leads to different preconditions, etc. Somewhere in this cycle, there is also a moment of sense making. People try to make sense of what's happening, and religion can play a part there. So, of course, we do see that even today, when disasters occur, people tend to look towards religious ways of making sense of things. People who are, well, who have a religion as an important part of their lives, but also other people. Sometimes they see the disaster as a way to discipline the population or to punish people for their wrongdoings. And we see that reoccurring during present day disasters. That's certainly true. I do think that at the moment, there are also other ways of making sense of things. And then we come back to this rule of experts that Maaike has just been mentioning. There are many people who would not turn to religion, but instead would turn to science, or would turn to perhaps a feeling of community, a feeling of being together, looking for comfort or for a sense of belonging, in which religion can play a part, but doesn't have to play a part. So perhaps if there are any additional points to be made by the two of you, go ahead.
Well, thanks a lot for this, Jessica. I think this response is a great one. I think I would rather tackle another question, and that is the question. So we write about history and we use history, but is there any relevance for today? Or is today very different from the past? So is it useful to investigate history? And I think that is a very important question. And it also has to do with the motivation for our book. And because we really feel it is relevant. And because sometimes in the past you saw that, well, all kinds of developments were seen as defining modernity, like capitalism, like very advanced technology, etc., making the past fundamentally different from the present. And I think this is a view we would not subscribe to. On the contrary, so I already started telling about history as a kind of a laboratory where we try to test ideas, concepts, theories empirically by using history. But maybe, Micah, you also want to say something about this.
Yeah, you often get these kind of questions. You often, when people are starting to talk about this book, it's yes, but today is everything is more extreme. Climate change is more extreme. We have nuclear energy, and so the risks are becoming much more important. And then you get these concepts like the anthropocene, and that we're in a fundamentally different era today, and that therefore we can learn some aspects about history. We can see them as some kind of examples but that we are fundamentally reaching new vulnerability levels or facing new risks or hazards that we have not encountered. And as you said, Bas, well, we all seven at least agree upon that it is actually not on a fundamentally different level. And that's some of the main arguments of the book, I think, that um, even though the scale might diverge, some hazards have become worse, bigger, but some have actually declined. But it's rather a measure of scale rather than being of a fundamentally different character. And therefore, it remains very important to look at that. What makes societies vulnerable? Do fundamental polarization or inequality levels, if it is detrimental in the past and it prevented people to respond, for example, well, then these lessons are still relevant today. So, of course, you always have to take into account, and you can't be deterministic about this, but there are certain things that we try to distinguish, that you say if you have that combination of preconditions with those kind of responses with that kind of hazard, well, then we think we can say that you become vulnerable and that you can actually learn that as a kind of laboratory from the past. And therefore we try to move beyond that kind of polarized distinction between an anthropocene today and the past that is a fundamentally different country, as we sometimes say as historians, and that we would rather not look at it in that way. And that's something that
Yeah,
we have put forward in the book.
yeah. And maybe to add a little bit, Micah, that is that I think that we also analyze how societies use different institutional instruments or arrangements to cope with hazards and disasters, like the market, the state, the family, and the association, the community, and these are still the ones we use. And that also think is very important, that these are all there in history. So we can all analyze how they function in relation to coping with hazards and disasters. So in the meantime, I also look at Jessica, and yeah, so I saw a great question. Also, I think, well, a very relevant one. Maybe Jessica, you want to tackle this one?
Yeah, I'm not sure if the audience is able to see the question, so I'll read it out.
Yeah,
This person
please.
says that he's looking forward to reading our book. That's great. But also, given that history is written by the victors and that most archive records reflect a small subset of people in power, how did you account for the marginalized or concealed voices of the past, those that are essential to adequately reflect the different winners and losers of disasters? I think that's a great question. Well, shall I make a start first, and then you can follow? Well, we do in the book we do have one chapter that discusses the kind of sources that we use, and there are a very wide range of sources, and this is a problem that this is of course a very real problem. It's a problem that many historians encounter, especially when you start writing about poor people and disasters very often hit poor people harder. And yes, it's very true, they're not as present in many sources as other kinds of people. But there are usually ways to find out more about them. I've done a lot of research myself into poor relief organizations. The records of these organizations are always, of course, written by the people who were in charge of the organization, by the board or the directors, whatever they were, the wardens, but they mention those poor people. And from those records, we do see what's going on with those people. And Tim, who is not here, but he has been doing research into flooding in the North Sea region, and he uses records such as records that refer to the sale of land after the disaster by people who were hit so hard that they could no longer hold on to their land. Tax records are also a way to find out more about what happened to this part of the population that was hit hardest. We very rarely hear them speak. That's true. There are not many records that actually record their words. But there are usually ways to find out more about them by looking at the records that have been written by those people in power, because there were good reasons to administer all of this very accurately, and that's helpful to us to write a book like this.
Yeah, and maybe Jessica, to add a little bit, I think that in the book, and also maybe because of our background, we also pay a lot of attention not only to the state, where this problem plays out clearly, and the market, but also we pay a lot of attention to the association. So associations of, let's say, well, middle class people, peasants, craftsmen, who organize themselves and try to cope with hazards. And I think now I'm looking at you, Micah, because, well, you know a lot about, for instance, how these associations, for instance, try to cope with the hazard of sand drift. So maybe you can give an example from this, because this is really where we see, well, let's say, ordinary people at play, at work, and trying to cope with this hazard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And indeed, as Jessica said, you can't hear them often. Like, they do not write things down. But for example, when I was looking at sand drift and how they were coping with it, I looked at the commons. And the commons are associations of people that manage resources collectively. And one of the hazards is if you do it incorrectly in certain regions, you get sand drift. And what I looked at, for example, were the regulations on what they implemented. And then I thought, what are actually the interests of the rich, of the middle classes, and of the poor people? And do these regulations actually match the interests of only one group, or maybe a couple of them? And certain rules were absolutely to the detriment of the rich people in that village. For example, limitations on the amount of sheep you could put on the commons, or certain limitations of power monopolization. And then I thought, they will not do that unless other people that do not have a real voice were actually heard. So in that way, in a more indirect way, you can sometimes see how these groups were actually able to really get their voices heard in another way. And so by looking at that and having, trying to find them, even though you can't really hear them in the source, you can still give them a voice in one way or another. So in that respect, we can find them somewhere.
We have another question, which is about information. The spread of information also plays a role in the response to disasters, I guess. And can we please say something about that? Is Bas or Micah?
Maybe I will stop very shortly, and then you can add. Information comes along a lot of times in the book because we discuss a lot, for example, traditional environmental knowledge, and that people are familiar with landscapes and with hazards and with risks, and that in a way either in a written form or via memory or via some kind of rituals. People can spread that knowledge. And that's very important, because that kind of memory and that kind of knowledge of certain hazards really often defines whether or not you're able to cope. And one of the examples in the book that we used, and it's actually based also on research of other scholars, for example, colleagues like Eleonora Roland, where you can see that actually by losing knowledge, or because new people have conquered the region, or because some certain elites have switched and you lost the knowledge, that then really deteriorates the problem, and then really the harshest disasters sometimes happen. So yes, absolutely, information is crucial, and we try to really discuss that in the book a lot. So
yeah, I think that's really nice, Maika, that the next question I can see coming in links up neatly with your response. And I will tell a little bit about the question that is posed by one of the people in the audience, a seismologist from California. He or she says, over the long term, how do you see society succeed or fail at remembering past disasters? Yeah. And even more, treating these past occurrences as relevant to the present. And that is really a challenge to do. So can you tell a little bit, Jessica, or you, about how societies did so and how they succeeded or not? And maybe also it's relevant to say something about when, for instance, in parts of the world which were colonized, where the colonizing powers often took different paths or decisions. And maybe one of you can tell a little bit about this.
So can I start, and then Micah can follow up?
Yeah.
Well, one of the cases that we discuss in the book, we've tried to discuss some case studies which keep returning in the book, and one of them is also related to hurricanes. And in this case, the situation in New Orleans comes to my mind. This is a situation where we know that at a certain point, new colonists arrived. First, the French arrived, and then after a while, no, first the Spanish arrived, and then the French arrived. Who's going to save me from this awful situation that I'm now in? I've forgotten the order of colonization, but the problem was that the colonists who arrived were unfamiliar with the situation in the place. They had never seen such a thing as a hurricane before, because in Europe they were not familiar with that kind of phenomenon. So they had no way of knowing how to deal with that. And it took them time to actually build up this memory of this kind of disaster and to find ways to deal with it. And then when the next colonizer came, the same thing happened all over. There was again, it required time to build up a memory, a remembrance of these disasters in order to be able to deal with the next occurrence. So this is highly relevant. And I think that we can now, in the present day situation, we have perhaps better ways of preserving these memories for new groups or for new generations. But it turns out that it's still not so easy, that people tend to perhaps not entirely forget, but at least forget the severity of how hard these disasters can hit if for a certain period they have not occurred. So this is indeed still a problem, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. I would agree, but then add from the book that we would say that it's not only about information that is neutral or objective, because I think we stress that information is often very much linked up with the possibility to decide decisions and to decide to determine outcomes. So it's also, information is also a social element, as it were, an element of, you could even say, of power, of decision making. So it very much depends on who. Do you want to say something about this, Jessica? Or I think it's
Yes,
important. Yeah.
regarding the first question about information, there were other ways of reading it than how Micah answered it. And one thing that came to my mind basically links up what you are now saying, Bas, and this is the story that we often hear about democracies being well, at least some way to guard against abuse of power. And this is one of the stories that is very much present when in discussions about famines. The notion that a democracy, because there is a free press that spreads information and that can also hold governments accountable, because of that, in democracies, famines do not occur as often because they will, because of the spread of information, make it more likely that preventative measures are being taken in a timely way to prevent the worst. So in that way, information can actually be a counterpower to well, to prevent famines or other types of disasters from occurring.
Yeah, yeah. So I can see a new question coming in, and I think it's a question that Micah can answer very well because she is working on sand drifts, which is. But I first read the question, Micah, and then
Yes.
I give you the floor to give an answer. So it's a good question. Do you identify any difference in vulnerability and response to disasters that emerge gradually, like droughts or famines, and those that happen largely without warning, as for instance volcanic eruptions or earthquakes? Well, you are working on sand drifts, Micah, so that
Yeah.
is a slow unfolding disaster par excellence. So can you tell a little bit more about this?
Yes, it's one, apart from maybe climate change, it's one of the slowest ones that you can study. So I get this question often, let's say. And yes, of course, if something is completely unexpected, like a meteorite that falls onto your village, yeah, of course it becomes often more difficult to respond. But still, not a lot of disasters are completely unpredictable. For example, a volcanic eruption, you need to be close to a volcano, or at least on a location on the Earth where there are tectonic plates and tectonic activity. So you will not encounter a hurricane in certain places, but you might expect one, even though it's 100 years ago when the last one struck. Most of them are really not that kind of unexpected. That's one. But again, for example, sand drifts are ridiculously slow. It takes decades or even centuries for that to become a real disaster. Often it's a couple of millimeters or centimeters of sand per year. So you will never get stuck. You will never die because of a sand drift. But still, what I discovered is that some societies are able to respond because they do take into account, okay, this is happening and this might become disastrous, while others do not. I studied one particular example of sand drifts in the Preconditions in England, where they had the same knowledge as they did in another region that I studied, the Campine area in, well, nowadays Belgium. And some took it into account and really learned from experience and really did build up that knowledge, while the others did not. So it's not necessarily the speed or the kind of knowledge that can build up. It's rather whether or not a society has the preconditions, but also has the possibility to respond, that defines whether or not something becomes a disaster, at least according to me, and at least according to most of the co-authors agreed with that, because sometimes you can have everything you need to respond, but that does not mean that people actually do respond. So even though when it takes decades, so it's more factors at play, even though of course it becomes much more dangerous when you have absolutely no indication that something will happen.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Micah. And well, it's nice that you said the other co-authors in majority or most of them agreed. This gives some insight in the way we've worked together, because we've often heavily debated amongst each other certain issues and to see how to come forward. So it was also a kind of an intellectual exercise. I can see another question coming in. Yeah, these are all great questions, but all difficult ones. So I think I opt to read it aloud in order to
Yeah,
give
you
Dean
should.
at least and Jessica and Micah some chance to think a little bit about a possible response. This is a member of the audience who proposes to unite two themes of this conversation so far. So, what is the relation between expert knowledge and local knowledge in decisions about resource management or resource access following a disaster? So, which did you see as most prevalent across the case studies? Expert knowledge or local knowledge? Well, this, of course, also depends a little bit on the period and the area where we're talking about. Expert knowledge has become much more important, much more prevalent over the past centuries. I think, is anyone, Jessica or Michael, wanting to say anything more about it? So, yeah.
Well, I think what you're now saying is basically, I think, an important point. We see over time that expert knowledge has been increasing, especially in the modern era, where it has become more important. This also has something to do with the role of the state, which tends to
Right.
rely on experts much more. So those two developments are connected. Local knowledge, I think, is still important, but well, for instance, in a situation, Bas, which you mentioned earlier, in colonial settings, it may simply not be, it may be there, the local knowledge, but there may be restrictions on it actually being used. And I think in the book we've tried to place a lot of emphasis on the importance of local knowledge, because we feel that it, as long as it's there, it's a good way to help prevent disasters. People who live in these regions are usually familiar with the circumstances. They know how to deal with it. At the same time, I think it should also be admitted that there are limits to what local knowledge and also small-scale technology can achieve. And we have, I think, also one of the examples that comes to mind to Dutchmen like Bas and me, at least, is, of course, the large-scale flood protection measures that have been taken in the Netherlands in the 1950s, 1960s to prevent the recurrence of flooding of low-lying coastal areas. And I think most people in the Netherlands today are still very much reliant on that kind of flood protection, and no longer do a lot with local knowledge to help keep them dry.
It's a good point, Jessica, and I think the point you stressed is the relationship also between experts and expert knowledge and the rise of centralized states. And that, I think, is an important issue, where I think expert knowledge has become much more important, particularly in the 18th, 19th centuries, and in some cases in a very favorable way. But to add to these big infrastructural works and the introduction of large-scale technological solutions in order to cope with hazards, I think another element we stress in the book, and I would like to mention, is that sometimes these also can create new vulnerabilities. Because it is not that in all circumstances they offer a full and permanent solution. Often they even create new circumstances, new preconditions on which a hazard can play out in a very serious way. So this again depends on the context, also the social and political context in which these are implemented. To come back again to your earlier point, Jessica, about the democratic context where governments can be held accountable, which we do have in the Netherlands, fortunately. But in other cases, we discuss where, for instance, colonial powers or other autocratic governments that cannot be held accountable develop these large-scale infrastructural works for other reasons. These can be prestige, these can be economic profit-making for small groups within society, short-term gains at the expense of long-term security, and also creating vulnerabilities for the people living in the place. So I can see yet another question, but maybe Jessica, Micah, you already had the chance to have a look at it.
I had a chance, and I think this is really right up your alley, Bas.
It is.
So it is. So you should answer this at least before the end of the hour. So I'm sometimes asked by my family how to use history to predict what will happen in the next year or two, and it seems to me that historians are among the worst forecasters. At least the person is doubtful about it. Although I can see the big sweep, there are so many minor factors involved, and knowing which one will impact events is quite beyond me. Any suggestions on making this process more useful for the short term? So can we predict and can we really make these kind of forecasts?
Oh, so you're looking at me now.
We're looking at you.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because I think you're one of the most experienced one in actually making that step to learn something from the past.
Okay, but then I think, well, this requires a very careful answer. So I think the problem with this member of the audience, if I may say so, without insulting somebody, is that he or she tries to predict what happens in the next year or two. That is problematic, and that is not something we would claim in the book, not at all. So what we would claim is that history offers the opportunity, by carefully selecting and comparing cases, to identify relevant variables. For instance, in a response, also in short-term effects, that is true, but particularly in the long-term outcomes of a disaster happening. And I would never dare, none of the 7 authors would dare to make predictions for 1 or 2 years. What we do is identify and highlight relevant variables, and also to show scenarios that can be projected into the future. And well, in this case, I'm thinking now of the current corona crisis, the COVID crisis, and you could also do so by saying, on the basis of what we've written in the book, that the main point will not be the direct response that we see now, but the main effect will be how do societies adapt or not their institutional arrangements and their societal arrangements to cope with the effect of this crisis. I'm not only thinking of the health crisis, but particularly also about the economic effects. And that this response will be shaped to a large extent by the relationships, also power disparities, the information disparities between certain groups in society, that this will be a main element. This is something you could say and you could further tease out. And I think that this is the way we would use history, and not to make very short-run projections or predictions about what will happen the next year.